There's a question that has been sitting with me this Advent, partly because of a book group I'm a part of. We just finished reading Silence by Shusaku Endo, a novel about a young Jesuit priest who sails to Japan in the 1600s to minister to Christians living under brutal persecution. He arrives expecting God to be close and active, but instead he encounters what he never imagined: silence. He watches people suffer for their faith. He begs God to intervene. He prays for deliverance, and heaven remains painfully quiet. Over time, it's really just this one question that haunts him: is God here? Is God listening? Has God abandoned his people? And while our circumstances are nothing like the world of that novel, the emotional question feels familiar. Many of us carry our own quiet version of that ache into the holidays. On the surface, this season is supposed to be warm and joyful and effortless. But just beneath that surface, there can be grief we didn't anticipate, loneliness we did not choose, strained relationships, or disappointment, and how life actually is compared to how we hoped it would be. There is the ideal Christmas, and then there is the real one. And it is into that ache, into that longing for a God who hears and shows up and answers, that today's gospel from Matthew speaks. And Matthew's answer is astonishingly simple. Look, a child, Emmanuel, God is with us. So this morning, what I want to do is slow down and just to notice three movements of grace in this passage, and then consider how those same movements trace their way through the contours of our lives. The first of those three movements being this: grace begins not in ideal circumstances, but in real ones. Matthew signals this from the very first line of today's gospel. Now, the birth of Jesus, he writes, took place in this way. Pay attention to that phrase, this way. Not that way. Not the cozy way. Not the Hallmark way. Not the peaceful, candlelit, everything is just right sort of way. No, the birth of Jesus, it took place in this way. This way being code for scandal, confusion, fear, misunderstanding, uncertainty, and a relationship hanging by a thread. Nothing in today's gospel is ideal or sentimental. It is unpolished, it is complicated, it is real. And the point could not be clearer. Grace does not wait for life to become ideal. Grace finds us in the life we actually have. I probably watch about 4 movies a year. 3 of them on average happen between December 26th and January 1st. One of those 3 is almost always A Christmas Carol. And even if you haven't read the book or seen the film, you know exactly who Grace finds in that story. It finds Scrooge, a man who is anything but ideal. He is not spiritually curious. He is not seeking God. He is not a good person. And yet, grace just storms into his life on Christmas Eve, not because he is good, but rather because God intends to make him good. Grace does not enter the ideal. Grace enters the real. And today's gospel is about God entering the real world, not the imagined one, not the curated one, not the everything's fine one. It is the world where divorce happens, sickness happens, grief happens, injustice happens, fear happens. where relationships fracture. It's a world where people feel lost and overwhelmed. This is the world God enters, which means that your life, your real, complicated, imperfect life, is not an obstacle to grace. It is the very place that grace always begins. One of my favorite authors, Henry Nouwen, returns again and again to a single theme in his writing, that God meets us not at the point of our competence, but rather at the point of our brokenness and vulnerability. That, he says, is where God's love is always the most tender and the most present. In one of his most famous books, it's called The Return of the Prodigal Son, Nouwen reflects on Rembrandt's famous painting of that particular parable. And if you know that painting, you know that it's a beautiful, beautiful painting. But theologically speaking, I think it misses something pretty essential. In Rembrandt's painting, the father embraces the runaway son, but he embraces him inside the house. But if you remember Jesus' parable, the father doesn't sit there waiting at the doorway. He actually runs out to meet his son in the far country, on the road, in the mess, before he cleans up, before anything gets resolved. And that is exactly how grace finds us. Not once we clean up and come inside the house, but rather on the road, in the mess, before anything is resolved. In this way. That is where grace begins. Not in the ideal, not after we have apologized, but in the far country, on the road, just as we are. And that brings me to the second movement of grace, that grace always finds us before we're ready. Matthew says that Mary was found to be with child, which means Joseph wasn't informed, wasn't prepared, certainly hadn't planned for any of this. And that word found really matters. Mary was found to be with child. The word found signals that grace is not something that we schedule or orchestrate. Grace is something that finds us. We are found by grace, just as Mary was. Which sounds nice, but there is something deeply disruptive about that. Mary's pregnancy being Exhibit A, it doesn't arrive at a convenient time. It doesn't come with an explanation that Joseph can live with. It threatens his reputation, his future, his sense of agency and control over his own life. Grace doesn't slide neatly into his plans. In fact, it kind of blows them apart. No wonder Joseph's first response is fear. He wants to step away quietly to contain the damage, to put everything back into a category he can manage and explain, but before he can do any of those things, God steps in. Grace moves before he's ready, before he understands, before he feels worthy. And that is how grace also moves in our life. It always has, and it always will. If you've seen Ted Lasso, you know the whole show begins with someone who is profoundly unprepared and profoundly unwanted. Ted gets hired to coach soccer, or lest I offend Father Josh, football in the UK. And Ted doesn't know the rules. He doesn't understand the culture. The reporters mock him. The fans hate him. The players don't trust him. And Rebecca, the owner, only hires him because she wants to tank the whole team. She really wants Ted to fail. No one wants him there, and he is absolutely not ready. And yet, if you've seen this show, the whole thing is very thick with grace. Characters who had no intention of changing end up getting healed, and people who resist kindness receive kindness anyway. But there's this recurring moment in the show, and it's one of my favorite threads, where Ted will show up in Rebecca's office every morning. He is completely uninvited. He knocks and says, "Biscuits with the boss." And then he hands her this little pink box with cookies. And at first she finds it very intrusive and inconvenient. She does not want to be around Ted. She just wants to get back to work. But that's exactly how Grace sneaks into her life, quietly, repetitively, through a small ritual act of kindness. She'll taste the biscuit, she'll pause, and in that little pause, her defenses start to crack. Grace works on Rebecca before she is ready, before she wants it, before she even believes in grace. Ted becomes this gentle symbol of a grace that heals and unites an entire community long before anyone is ready for grace or even wants it. And honestly, this hits very close to home for me. I mean, if readiness were a requirement for serving God, I certainly would never have been a priest. When God called me, I was not ready. If someone had handed me a detailed job description of what this work actually looks like week in and week out when I was 22 years old and said, "Can you carry this for a lifetime?" I would have said, "No way. I'm absolutely not capable of doing that." Grace found me before I was ready, and then grace made me ready. And I wonder, where has that been true for you? Where did grace find you before you were prepared, before you felt worthy, before you understood what God was doing? Because my suspicion is that it has. And I think part of our spiritual work in Advent is simply to wake up and to see it, to look back and to realize, oh, God was there the whole time, long before I was ready. And if God has done that before, then God will most certainly do that again. And now third, the most important movement of grace. Grace tells us not to be afraid, because Emmanuel means God is with us. The angel's very first word to Joseph is the same word God always speaks into human fear. It is the most repeated commandment in the Bible. 4 words: do not be afraid. Now, to be clear, grace does not say this because there's nothing frightening in the world, or because there's nothing frightening about our life, nor does God say this because Joseph suddenly understands God's plan. God says it because God is drawn near. God says, do not be afraid, because God is with Joseph. And friends, this is the beating heart of the Christian gospel, not God above us, not God against us, not God waiting for us to improve ourselves, but God with us. God alongside us. God in the silence. God in the ache. God in the questions we wish we did not have. When our girls were little, there were seasons when someone was always waking up at 2 a.m. with a nightmare. And I'll be honest, Emily and I handled those moments very differently. If one of the girls shook me awake and whispered, "Dad, there's a monster under my bed," I was exhausted, half asleep, and my instinct was to explain things. I'd begin by offering a calm, rational, reasonable, completely unhelpful lecture. "Sweetheart, that is an irrational fear. There is no monster. Monsters aren't real. Looking at this, statistically speaking, this room is perfectly safe." Shockingly, that never worked. And you could actually see my girls thinking, "Oh my God, my dad is completely useless. Go get mom." And so I'd go and I'd get mom. And Emily is much wiser, and she never began with an argument or a lecture. She would just sit on the edge of the bed, or maybe she would slide under the covers, and she'd put her arm around our girls and whisper, "I'm here. You're safe. You are not alone." And their fear disappeared, not because the threat was removed and not because the girls finally agreed with my statistical analysis, right? But because Mom was present. And friends, that's exactly what Joseph receives. God does not show up with a theological lecture. God does not say, "Hey, Joseph, statistically speaking, you're going to be fine." No, God speaks the one thing every fearful heart most needs to hear: do not be afraid. I am with you. You know, from the perspective of redemption, if we were to look at our life from the perspective of eternity, so many of our fears lose their power. Fear of failure, fear of the future, fear of loss, fear of death itself. God sees the end of the story. God knows that monsters aren't real the way that we imagine them to be, but God also knows that we're children. And children don't need explanations. Children need presence. So what does God do? God comes near, not to correct us, not to shame us, but to sit on the edge of the bed of our world and whisper, "I'm here, you're safe. You're not alone. I am Emmanuel." Theologian Karl Barth has this extraordinary way of describing the incarnation. He says, and this is my paraphrase, that in Jesus, God enters the far country, the broken, contradictory world we actually inhabit. But then he adds this breathtaking line: God does not will to be God without us. I just want you to think about that. God the Father runs into the far country of our life, just like the Father in Jesus' parable. Why? Because God refuses to be God without you. So what does that mean for your Christmas? It means this: whatever comes, perfect or imperfect, it is not an obstacle to God. It is the very place where God arrives. If your Christmas is joyful and cozy, God is with you. If it's painful, God is with you. If it's confusing, God is with you. If it's quiet, God is with you. If it's lonely, God is with you. You know, whenever Joseph wakes up from his dream, the world has not changed. Herod still rules. The rumors about Mary are still circulating. Nothing about his life or his world is simple. The world hasn't changed. But Joseph has changed. Because Joseph discovers that Emmanuel is not a doctrine, it's a presence, it's a person. The question we began with was this: is God here? Is God listening? Has God abandoned his people? Where is God? Matthew answers, right here, in the manger, in the mess, in the middle of your real life. This is Emmanuel. In this way, God is with us. Amen.